I was the forgotten one. At every holiday dinner, my father raised his glass to my older brother's law firm victories, or my sister's medical school residency. When it came to me, I was a ghost at the table. If I spoke about my projects, they laughed. When I asked for support, they dismissed me with silence. To them, I was the screw-up, the one destined to fail. They told me flat out, "You'll never be anything." That sentence became my cage. For years, I carried their rejection like a weight on my chest. But I wasn't broken, I was planning. What they didn't know was that I was building something in silence, something they couldn't laugh off or ignore. And when the moment came to reveal it, the tables turned. The very people who said I was nothing now had no choice but to recognize that I had become everything. My name is Alex Carter. I'm 28 years old, male, and if you asked my family to describe me, they'd probably say the lost cause. On paper, I'm a freelance software developer. In reality, back then, it felt more like I was just clawing my way through life one short-term contract at a time, coding late into the night for companies that barely remembered my name after the invoices cleared. My family never missed an opportunity to remind me how invisible they thought I was. Every holiday dinner at my parents' house in Maplewood followed the same script, like a cruel play I'd been cast in without lines. Dad at the head of the table, puffed up with pride as he bragged about my older brother Daniel's latest courtroom victory. Daniel was 31, a lawyer at a downtown firm with a corner office and a Rolex on his wrist, and every achievement he touched turned to gold, at least, that's how my parents told it. Then came Claire, my younger sister by 3 years. Claire was in her 3rd year of medical residency, working 80-hour weeks, saving lives, and giving my mom endless reasons to beam across the table like she'd birthed a saint. They'd toast to her stamina, her brilliance, her future. And then their eyes would turn to me. Always the same moment, always the same crushing silence that hung over the table like fog. "What about you, Alex?" Dad would ask, his voice pretending to be casual but carrying that smug weight of expectation, as though he was teeing me up for a punchline. The smirk on his lips always gave him away. He didn't really want to know. He wanted to remind everyone else of the gap between us. If I tried to talk about my projects, apps I'd been developing, contracts I'd landed, Daniel would roll his eyes and mutter something under his breath. Claire would smirk in that polished, condescending way only she could manage, her medical credentials like armor against anything I said. Sometimes they wouldn't even bother with words. Just silence, forks scraping across plates, the conversation pivoting as if I hadn't spoken at all. One Thanksgiving, the memory carved into my mind sharper than the carving knife in Dad's hand, the dismissal hit me harder than usual. The dining room smelled of roasted turkey, thyme, and sage. Mom's best china reflected the warm glow of the chandelier overhead. The table was immaculate, crystal glasses, silver cutlery polished to a mirror shine. I had just finished a contract for a startup in Boston, designing a back-end system that actually impressed their CTO. I was proud of it. It wasn't world-changing, but it was mine, and I wanted to share it. I barely got 2 sentences out before Dad cut me off. He set his fork down with a deliberate clink against the porcelain, dabbed gravy from his chin with his napkin, and said, "Alex, one day you'll have to stop playing around with these little side projects and get a real job. Your brother and sister can't carry this family's reputation forever." The words landed heavy, like someone had dropped a weight into my chest. I looked around the table. Daniel smirked. Claire hid a laugh behind her wineglass. Mom avoided my eyes and busied herself rearranging the cranberry sauce dish. Not one person defended me. I swallowed the sting, forced a smile, speared another piece of turkey, and said nothing. Because what was the point? Anything I said would be twisted into another sign of my failure. After dinner, while the others moved into the living room for pie and coffee, I found myself standing alone in the den. The window was cold beneath my fingertips as I stared out at the street, the autumn leaves rustling in the wind, the streetlights flickering one by one into life. Their laughter drifted in from the other room, warm, easy, full of belonging. It hit me then, in the pit of my stomach. I wasn't just ignored, I was useful to them in a different way. I was the scapegoat, the family's cautionary tale. The one they pointed to so they could say, "See? That's what happens if you don't live up to expectations. Don't be like Alex." They needed me at the bottom. My failure was the pedestal that made their successes look taller. But here's the thing about being underestimated, it's blinding. They didn't really see me. Not my late nights coding until my eyes burned. Not the rejection letters I stacked neatly in a folder instead of throwing away. Not the quiet resolve building in my chest each time they dismissed me. Their arrogance was a blindfold, and I knew, with a kind of cold certainty, that one day I'd rip it off in a way they couldn't ignore. That night, As I stood in the shadows of the den with their laughter spilling down the hall, I made myself a promise. Not out loud, not even in a whisper. Just a vow I carved into my bones: I would prove them wrong. And when I did, I wouldn't just prove it, I'd make them choke on every word they had ever thrown at me. I didn't know when or how yet. But I knew this much: the day was coming. If you've ever grown up in the shadow of someone else's spotlight, you know the peculiar mix of resentment and invisibility it breeds. My brother Daniel and my sister Claire weren't just successful, they were mythologized. They were the golden children, the ones my parents held up as proof that the Carter family had made it. And I was the unspoken footnote at the bottom of the page. Daniel was 3 years older than me, and since childhood, he'd been groomed as the heir to my father's legacy. Dad was an accountant, not a lawyer, but he carried an almost religious respect for the legal profession. When Daniel announced at 17 that he wanted to study law, Dad's chest swelled like he'd won the lottery. Every dinner conversation from that day forward became about LSAT scores, internships, and firm placements. By 28, Daniel had the kind of life my parents worshipped. He drove a black BMW 5 Series, lived in a loft apartment overlooking the river, and wore suits tailored so sharply they could cut glass. My father never missed an opportunity to brag about his courtroom wins. Daniel crushed opposing counsel in a fraud case today, or the firm just gave Daniel another high-profile client. The pride in his voice was palpable, like Daniel's victories were his own. Then there was Claire. If Daniel was Dad's pride, Claire was Mom's joy. She was only 25, but she had already carved out her place in the world of medicine. She had the grades, the discipline, the drive, and the halo effect that comes with wearing a white coat. Family friends would call her Dr. Claire even before she earned the title. Claire's stories at the dinner table painted her as a hero in Scrubs: patients saved, grueling hours endured, professors praising her diagnostic instincts. Mom soaked up every word, eyes glistening with pride. She'd reach across the table to squeeze Claire's hand, her voice thick with emotion. "You're going to change lives, sweetheart." And me? I was the cautionary tale. When people asked about me, my parents' tone changed. Their eyes would flicker away, their words become vague. "Oh, Alex is doing some computer work. He's figuring things out." The contrast was deliberate, a quiet weapon they wielded without mercy. The worst part wasn't the words, it was the way they looked at me. Daniel's smirk that said, "I've already won this race you never even started." Claire's half-pitying, half-condescending tilt of her head. And my parents' silence, the kind that carried judgment heavier than any insult. I remember one particular Sunday dinner. Mom had made roast chicken, lemon and rosemary filling the air, and the four of us kids, well, 3 golden children and me, sat with our parents in the dining room. Daniel launched into a story about a high-profile client whose assets he'd helped protect. Claire chimed in with her own tale about diagnosing a rare condition in an ER shift. Dad leaned back, pride swelling in his chest, Mom's eyes misty with admiration. Then, like clockwork, the silence fell. The space where I was supposed to contribute. "So, Alex," Dad said, carving another piece of chicken, "what are you working on these days?" My fork froze halfway to my mouth. I swallowed hard, then mentioned I was coding a mobile app for a logistics startup, something small, but promising. Daniel snorted. "Another app? You know 99% of those things crash and burn, right? It's like buying lottery tickets." Claire chimed in, "Maybe you should think about something more stable. You know, like teaching coding to kids or something. At least then it would be useful." Mom didn't say anything. She just topped off their wine glasses and let the humiliation hang in the air. That was the Carter family dynamic in a nutshell. 2 golden children shining so brightly the rest of us were expected to orbit them, and me, cast as the dark reminder of what happens when you fall short. What they didn't understand was that their cruelty wasn't crushing me, it was crystallizing something inside me. Each smirk, each dismissive word, each silence chipped away at my patience and replaced it with resolve. They thought they were burying me, but all they were doing was planting me deeper. I learned to study them carefully in those moments. Their vanity. Their blind spots. Their arrogance. The way Daniel equated success with power, the way Claire equated it with validation, the way my parents equated it with appearances. Every boast they made, every subtle jab they threw my way, I stored it like evidence. Not for revenge, not yet, but for understanding. Because I knew one thing with certainty: if I was ever going to prove them wrong, it wouldn't be with a loud declaration or an argument across the dinner table. It would be with proof so undeniable, so irrefutable, that even the golden children would have to bow their heads in silence. That realization didn't dull the sting of their words, but it gave me something sharper than pain: Purpose. There are moments in life that don't just hurt, they brand you. They etch themselves into your bones so deeply that no matter how much time passes, you can still hear the exact tone of voice, still see the expression on the person's face, still feel the air in the room. For me, that moment came one rainy March evening when my father looked me in the eyes and told me I would never be anything. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't an argument. It was worse than that, it was said with calm certainty, like a judge handing down a sentence. I was 23, just a few years out of college. I had been working on a project with two friends from school, a software tool designed to help small businesses manage inventory more efficiently. We were young, optimistic, and full of caffeine-fueled conviction. When we pitched the idea to a few local investors, the meetings hadn't gone well. One guy laughed outright. Another politely said it wasn't scalable. A third told us to come back when we had real experience. I came home to my parents' house that night, soaked through from the rain, still clutching my laptop bag like it was a lifeline. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and the lingering scent of Dad's cigar. He was sitting in the den, leather recliner tilted back, the TV muted on a financial news channel. He didn't even look up when he said, "How'd it go?" I hesitated, then admitted, "Not great." They said no. "But it's early, we're still refining the pitch." That's when he looked at me. Slowly, like it was almost a chore to give me his attention. His eyes were cool, the way he looked at a broken calculator or a tax form with a mistake on it. "Alex," he said, his voice steady and low, "at some point, you have to accept reality. You're not cut out for this. You've always been average. And average doesn't build companies. You need to stop wasting time chasing dreams and get a stable job. Because otherwise, you're going to end up with nothing. You'll never be anything." I can't describe the silence that followed. It was heavy, suffocating, pressing against my ribs. My throat tightened, my pulse pounded in my ears, but I didn't argue. I didn't scream or defend myself. I just nodded once, muttered okay, and left the room. Upstairs, I closed the door to my old bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the faded posters of bands I no longer listened to. His words replayed in my head like a recording stuck on repeat. "You'll never be anything. You'll never be anything." Most people think anger is loud. For me, that night, anger was quiet. It was a slow, steady burn that settled deep inside me. My father thought he was being practical, grounding me in reality. What he didn't realize was that his words didn't crush me, they caged me. And once you're in a cage, you have two choices: accept it, or learn how to break out. I remember opening my laptop, rain still dripping from my hair onto the keyboard, and typing out a sentence in the Notes app, "Prove him wrong." That became my mantra. Every rejection, every smirk from Daniel, every condescending smile from Claire, every silence from Mom, it all funneled into that vow. I started keeping a notebook. Not of business ideas, but of promises to myself. Each time someone dismissed me, I wrote it down. Each insult, each slight, each rolled eye, I logged it like evidence in a trial. The entries weren't long, just a few sentences, but each one sharpened my resolve. Claire said teaching coding might be more useful. Translation: she thinks I'm incapable of real innovation. Daniel called my project a lottery ticket. He doesn't understand discipline, only winning. Dad, you'll never be anything. Direct quote. Remember the date, March 14th. I didn't know it at the time, but that notebook became the seed of my strategy. Because documenting injustice isn't just about remembering, it's about building proof. Proof of their blindness. Proof of their arrogance. Proof that when the day came, I could hold up their words like a mirror and watch them flinch. For the next several years, that phrase, "you'll never be anything," stayed with me. I carried it through sleepless nights of coding, through ramen dinners in my one-bedroom apartment, through the sting of rejection emails. It was the weight on my chest and the fuel in my veins all at once. My father thought he'd buried me under those words. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't soil. I was bedrock. And bedrock doesn't break, it builds. The first real shift happened when I stopped caring about convincing anyone and started caring only about documenting everything. I learned early that family arguments weren't about truth, they were about perception. Daniel could spin a half-truth into a victory speech, Claire could dress up an insult as advice, and my parents. They simply decided which version of reality looked best and believed it. If I ever tried to defend myself, it was my word against theirs. And in my family's courtroom, I was always guilty. So I started keeping records. Every email, every contract, every line of code I pushed, I saved it. Not just in folders on my computer, but with timestamps, backups, encrypted copies. I created a trail no one could erase. I didn't know exactly why at first. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was instinct. But deep down, I think I understood something important. When the day came to reveal what I'd built, it couldn't just be a story. It had to be evidence. I rented a small apartment above a laundromat, the kind where the air smelled faintly of detergent and the walls shook whenever the dryers downstairs kicked on. My office was a folding card table and a refurbished Dell tower I'd bought secondhand for $300. The desk lamp flickered sometimes when I ran both the computer and the space heater, but it was mine. Most nights, I'd sit there until 2 or 3 in the morning, headphones in, the hum of the machines below mixing with the click of my keyboard. I worked freelance contracts during the day to pay rent, but at night I poured everything into my own project. The idea was simple, a logistics optimization tool for mid-sized businesses. I'd seen firsthand how much money small companies wasted on inefficient routes, poor inventory management, and manual spreadsheets. Everyone was chasing flashy consumer apps, but this was different. Quiet. Unsexy. But real. I built in silence, line by line. Python scripts turning into frameworks, frameworks turning into features, features turning into a platform. I documented every commit on GitHub, every update stored with timestamps. I didn't talk about it at family dinners, not even once. To them, I was still just messing around with code. And I let them believe it. Because silence was my weapon. I also kept a binder, yes, a physical binder, of receipts, signed contracts from small freelance jobs, screenshots of payment confirmations, client testimonials. I built a trail as meticulous as any lawyer's case file. If Daniel lived on courtroom victories and Claire on patient charts, then I would live on proof. Undeniable, unshakable proof. But progress was slow. There were nights I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred, the cursor blinking like it was mocking me. Nights when I wanted to throw the keyboard across the room and admit my father was right. Nights when rejection emails piled up in my inbox, polite versions of the same message, not interested. Still, I logged every setback, every late night, every breakthrough. Because I knew something most people don't: the world forgets your failures the moment you succeed, but it never lets you forget them yourself. My binder, my code repositories, my notebooks, they weren't just records. They were my insurance policy against erasure. The day would come when I'd need to show the world, and my family, exactly what I'd built. Not as a story they could laugh off, but as hard evidence they couldn't dismiss. Looking back now, I realize those years of silence were my most important weapon. Every smirk at the dinner table, every dismissal, they made me hungrier. They made me sharper. And while my siblings shined in the spotlight, I was learning something they never understood: real power doesn't announce itself. Real power builds quietly, patiently, until it's ready to strike. By the time they realized, it would be too late. If you want to know what failure tastes like, it isn't bitterness, it's metallic, sharp, like biting down on a coin. That's how it felt each time I tried to move my project forward and was met with rejection. By then, I had the foundations of the logistics platform built. It wasn't polished, but it worked. It could analyze delivery routes, inventory flow, and labor costs, then recommend adjustments that saved money. I knew it had potential. What I didn't have was funding. So I did what every hopeful entrepreneur does: I started knocking on doors. I put together a pitch deck, clean and minimal, charts, projections, mock-ups of the interface. I booked meetings with small angel investors around town. The first one was in a glossy office downtown, all glass walls and exposed brick. The investor, a man in his 40s with a Rolex that probably cost more than my annual rent, listened for exactly 5 minutes before leaning back in his chair and saying, "You're too small. You don't have the pedigree. Come back when you've got traction." The second meeting went worse. A woman with perfectly manicured nails and an MBA from Harvard didn't even let me finish. "Logistics?" she said, wrinkling her nose. "That's boring. Nobody invests in boring." The third one stung the most. I thought I had built a rapport with this guy. He even smiled through my presentation, asked good questions. But at the end, he leaned forward, clasped his hands, and said, "You seem smart, Alex. But honestly, this isn't going anywhere. Maybe think about joining a real company instead of wasting your time." 3 meetings. 3 doors slammed shut. But the rejections didn't stop there. I sent cold emails to dozens of investors, accelerators, incubators. Most never replied. A few sent canned responses about fit and focus. Each no landed in my inbox like a stone. And when I tried to talk about any of this with my family, that's when the humiliation hit hardest. One Sunday dinner, I made the mistake of mentioning I'd pitched to an investor. I didn't even say how it went, I just said I'd done it. Daniel smirked, carving into his steak. Investors? For your little app? Hate to break it to you, Alex, but people don't throw money at hobbies. Claire laughed softly, sipping her wine. Well, at least you're putting yourself out there. That's something. Her tone dripped with the kind of pity that makes your skin crawl. Dad didn't laugh. He just gave me the same look he always did when I spoke about my work, like he was checking a box before changing the subject. You should really think about stability. Law firms and hospitals don't close their doors overnight. Tech startups do. You need a career, not pipe dreams. That was the moment it clicked for me. They weren't just unsupportive, they were invested in my failure. If I succeeded, it would force them to confront the fact that they'd been wrong about me for years. And for people like them, being wrong was worse than being cruel. I left dinner early that night, the taste of metal thick in my mouth, humiliation buzzing in my veins like static electricity. But under it all, there was something else, defiance. I realized that I didn't need their approval, and I didn't need investors, at least not yet. If every door slammed shut, I'd build my own door. If no one wanted to back me, I'd back myself. So I took on more freelance work, web apps, back-end systems, anything that paid. I lived lean. Instant ramen, thrift store furniture, a mattress on the floor. Every extra dollar went into servers, software licenses, and cloud credits. I funneled my frustration into code. It was brutal. There were nights I lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling of my apartment, wondering if my father was right, if maybe I really was destined to be nothing. But each morning, I'd sit back down at the card table, fire up the Dell, and keep going. Every rejection, every slammed door, every smirk at the dinner table, it all became fuel. If no one believed in me, fine. I would build something they couldn't ignore. Not because they gave me permission, but because I refused to stay in the cage they'd built for me. And when the time came, they wouldn't just see what I had built, they'd see themselves, reflected in every failure they mocked, every word they dismissed. There's a kind of silence that isn't empty, it's alive. The silence of focus. The silence of building something no one else can see. That became my world. After the door slammed shut, I stopped wasting time trying to convince anyone, investors, family, friends. Words had failed me too many times. From that point forward, my proof would come in the form of working code, contracts, revenue. Nothing else. My life settled into a brutal rhythm. Days were for survival. I'd wake up at 6:30 in my shoebox apartment, brew cheap coffee in a dented French press, and log on to whatever freelance contracts I had managed to line up. Sometimes it was debugging a legacy system for a Midwestern insurance company. Sometimes it was building a simple website for a local business that paid me $800 for 2 weeks of work. It was never glamorous, but it kept the lights on. Nights were for building my project. I'd shut the blinds, put on noise-canceling headphones, and dive into the code. Hours disappeared. The only light came from my dual monitors and the flickering desk lamp that threatened to give out every few weeks. I ate meals at the keyboard, instant ramen, peanut butter sandwiches, cold pizza. My friends stopped inviting me out. My phone gathered dust. Weekends blurred into weekdays. It wasn't glamorous. It was obsessive. And in that silence, progress happened. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably. I added machine learning algorithms that refined delivery routes in real time. I built dashboards sleek enough that even non-technical users could interpret the data. I beta tested with a small courier service willing to let me run the program in parallel with their existing system. Within a month, they saved 12% on fuel costs. That number became the first real proof I'd been waiting for. But no one knew. Not my family. Not even my closest friends. At Christmas, I sat at the family table, listening to Daniel brag about his firm's holiday bonus and Claire talk about a surgery she'd assisted on. When my father inevitably asked, "And how's the coding going?" I smiled and said, "Fine." That was it. Just one word. The silence was my weapon. Because in silence, they underestimated me. And the more they underestimated me, the stronger I became. Of course, silence had a cost. There were nights when exhaustion hit so hard I fell asleep with my face pressed against the keyboard, the imprint of the keys on my cheek. Times when the money ran so thin I debated selling my monitors just to make rent. Days when I stared at error logs for hours, unable to find the bug, wondering if I was wasting years of my life on something doomed to fail. And then there were the rejections. Not from investors anymore, I'd stopped chasing those, but from potential clients. Small businesses I cold emailed, offering free trials, demos. Most never replied. A few sent polite dismissals, not interested at this time. Each one landed like a hammer on my resolve. But I kept going. Because the silence had taught me something. Resilience isn't loud. It doesn't roar. It whispers, just one more day. Just one more line of code. Just one more chance. That whisper carried me through the hardest year of my life. By the end of it, my platform was no longer a collection of scripts and dreams. It was a product. A living system with real clients, real results, and real potential. The beta tests showed consistent savings. The dashboards were stable. The back end could handle scale. And tucked away in my binders and cloud folders were the records, emails, contracts, financial statements, client testimonials, all neatly dated and stored. Proof. Evidence. Still, I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. My family thought I was barely scraping by. Daniel joked once that I'd probably be living in that shoebox apartment forever. Claire laughed. Mom didn't correct them. Dad just nodded grimly, like he agreed. I let them believe it. I let them keep underestimating me. Because the silence was almost over. And when it broke, it would shatter everything. Breakthroughs rarely happen in a blinding flash. They creep up on you, disguised as small wins, until suddenly you realize you've crossed an invisible line. For me, that line appeared on a Tuesday evening in March, when I opened my email and saw a subject line that made my pulse spike. Proposal accepted, contract attached. The sender was a mid-sized distribution company out of Cleveland. I had pitched them weeks earlier, offering to let them trial my platform for free. They hadn't responded, so I assumed it was another rejection. But now, not only had they replied, they wanted in. The contract was worth $25,000 for a 6-month pilot program. It wasn't venture capital money, but it was real. Money that wasn't just survival. Money that proved my work had value. I sat there in my cramped apartment above the laundromat, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, staring at the PDF until my hands shook. For the first time in years, I felt something other than quiet defiance. I felt vindication. That first contract changed everything. Once the pilot launched, their numbers spoke louder than I ever could. Within 3 months, their distribution costs dropped by 14%. The COO sent me an email, short, direct, but more gratifying than any applause. This is saving us real money. Keep it running. I framed that email. Literally printed it, slid it into a cheap frame, and hung it on the peeling wall above my desk. Because for the first time, I had external proof. It wasn't just me believing in myself anymore, someone else did, too. Word spread slowly, the way it always does in business. One referral led to another. By the end of the year, I had 3 clients on paid contracts. The income wasn't enormous, but it was steady, sustainable, and scaling upward. But here's the thing, I didn't tell anyone. Not my family. Not even when the money started covering my rent easily, when I upgraded my card table to an actual desk, when I replaced the flickering lamp with a sleek LED that didn't buzz. Because silence was still my weapon. At family dinners, nothing changed. Daniel bragged about his promotion to senior partner, flashing his Rolex as he gestured. Claire complained about 80-hour work weeks but basked in Mom's admiration. When they asked about me, I kept my answers vague. Still coding. Still freelancing. I watched the smirks, the sighs, the dismissive glances, and I said nothing. Inside, though, the breakthrough was growing. My bank account ticked upward. My binders filled with signed contracts, client testimonials, data reports. Every new proof was another brick in the foundation of something undeniable. Of course, success didn't erase the struggle. There were still nights when bugs in the code made me want to tear my hair out. Still days when prospective clients ghosted me. Still moments when doubt whispered that maybe it was just a fluke. But then I'd open that framed email, read those words again, "This is saving us real money," and the doubt went quiet. I started noticing changes in myself, too. I stood a little straighter. My voice didn't shake when I spoke to clients. I stopped second-guessing every line of code. The cage my father's words had built around me, "You'll never be anything," was still there, but I could feel the cracks forming. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty, this was only the beginning. Breakthroughs aren't just about success, they're about leverage. And now, for the first time, I had it. My family still saw me as the ghost at the table, the disappointment. Let them. Because while they laughed, I was building momentum. And when the time came to reveal it, the silence I'd kept would explode like a bomb. And they would never recover from the blast. Success, I learned, isn't one big leap, It's 1,000 small steps that quietly pile up until the weight of them can no longer be ignored. By the time I landed my fourth client, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something dangerous. Something they wouldn't be able to dismiss, no matter how hard they tried. The Cleveland Distribution Company renewed their contract without hesitation. The COO even increased the scope, asking me to extend the platform across multiple branches. That expansion alone doubled my revenue. 2 months later, a regional courier service signed on after hearing about the savings I'd generated. Then a third company. Then a fourth. Each new deal added another layer of proof, another set of documents to my growing archive. My once thin binder expanded into 3, then 5, then a row of identical black binders on the shelf above my desk. Inside, contracts signed, invoices paid, testimonials emailed, usage data logged. Everything dated, time-stamped, verifiable. I wasn't just building a business, I was building a case. Every night after coding, I'd back up files to multiple locations, cloud storage, encrypted drives, even a fireproof safe I bought secondhand. I started keeping meticulous spreadsheets, tracking growth month over month. Revenue curves climbing. Client lists lengthening. I didn't need applause, I had numbers, and numbers don't lie. Meanwhile, at family dinners, the charade continued. Daniel, freshly promoted to senior partner, bragged about his massive client portfolio. Claire lamented her long shifts but accepted the praise of saving lives with gracious humility. My parents glowed with pride, eyes darting between their golden children like they were basking in the reflection of their success. Then came my turn. "So, Alex," Dad said one Sunday, sipping his scotch, "how's the coding going? Landed that billion-dollar idea yet?" Daniel chuckled, swirling his wine. "Don't be ridiculous, Dad. If he had, we'd all know. Headlines, interviews, something. Not silence." I just smiled and said, "Still plugging away." And the silence ate them alive. They mistook it for failure, when in reality it was power. Every laugh, every smirk, they had no idea that my revenue had already surpassed Claire's residency salary. They had no idea that my little projects were paying me more than Daniel's firm bonuses. They had no idea because I hadn't told them. But that was the plan. Because silence buys you invisibility, and invisibility buys you time. Time to build leverage. By the second year, the platform wasn't just functional, it was thriving. I hired 2 part-time developers to help with maintenance. I contracted a UX designer to polish the interface. Suddenly, it didn't feel like a one-man operation anymore. It felt like a company. And the numbers backed it up. My annual revenue crossed 6 figures. Then mid-6 figures. Contracts renewed automatically. Clients referred me without prompting. The platform was no longer an idea. It was infrastructure. Still, I said nothing. Instead, I tightened the net. Every record stored, every milestone logged, every dollar accounted for. I kept screenshots of revenue dashboards with timestamps. I saved call recordings with clients, legally, of course, documenting praise, confirmation, validation. If Daniel ever tried to argue it's not real, I could bury him in proof. My father's words haunted me still, "You'll never be anything." But now, every document, every bank statement, every testimonial was a nail in the coffin of that sentence. The net wasn't just around my family, it was around me, too. A web of proof so intricate that even if they wanted to dismiss me, they couldn't. By the end of the second year, I realized something chilling. I didn't just want to prove them wrong. I wanted to trap them in their own arrogance. To let them laugh, dismiss, condescend, until the moment I pulled the curtain back and forced them to choke on every word. And the best part? They were making it easy for me. Every smirk, every joke, every cutting remark, they were writing the script of their own humiliation. All I had to do was keep tightening the net until they walked straight into it. And they would. Because arrogance blinds people. And my family was blind enough to step right into the trap I was setting. Every trap needs a stage. Mine came gift-wrapped in the form of my parents' annual 4th of July barbecue. The Carter barbecue was practically a town event. Dozens of family friends crowded the backyard, the grill smoking, kids running across the lawn with sparklers. Daniel showed up in a tailored polo, his BMW gleaming in the driveway. Claire wore her scrubs under a cardigan, the subtle flex of someone who wanted everyone to know she'd come straight from saving lives. My parents beamed, proud hosts in their element. And me? I arrived in jeans and a plain button-up, carrying nothing but a cooler of soda. I looked ordinary. Forgettable. Exactly how I wanted to look. The night unfolded predictably. Daniel held court by the grill, telling stories about his firm's wealthy clients. Claire perched beside Mom on the patio, humbly recounting a near miracle she'd overseen in the ER. The crowd listened, nodding, impressed. My parents floated between groups, basking in borrowed glory. Then, as always, someone turned to me. "So, Alex," an old family friend said, her voice bright but laced with the kind of pity people reserve for strays. "What are you up to these days?" Before I could answer, Daniel laughed. "Still coding in that shoebox apartment, right?" He glanced around the circle, waiting for the chuckles. They came. Claire gave her patented sympathetic smile. Dad shook his head with mock exasperation. I didn't laugh. I didn't even blink. I simply pulled my phone from my pocket, unlocked it, and opened my dashboard app. Then I turned the screen outward, placing it on the patio table where everyone could see. "Actually," I said, my voice calm, "this is what I've been working on." The screen showed a live revenue graph, numbers climbing steadily upward. 6 figures. Then 7. Monthly contracts displayed in neat rows, each stamped with client logos recognizable even to people outside the industry. The silence that fell was unlike any I'd ever heard at a Carter gathering. Forks paused midair. Daniel's smirk froze. Claire blinked rapidly, her mouth opening then closing. My father's face drained of color, his scotch glass trembling slightly in his hand. I let the silence stretch. "This is a logistics optimization platform I built," I continued, measured, factual. "It's used by distribution companies across 3 states. Current annual revenue is $3.2 million and climbing. These are the contracts. All verified. All current." I slid a folder onto the table, a neat binder, one of many. Inside were copies of contracts, testimonials, press clippings from trade publications. Hard evidence. "This isn't a hobby," I said softly. "It's a company. And I built it from nothing." The crowd shifted. Friends leaned in, eyes widening, whispers spreading. One man, a small business owner, even asked for my card. My father's jaw tightened. Daniel looked like he'd swallowed glass. Claire flushed red, staring down at her hands. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I just let the evidence sit there, undeniable. Because the truth is, humiliation doesn't need volume, it needs proof. For years, they had laughed at me, dismissed me, told me I'd never be anything. And now, in front of family friends, neighbors, colleagues, their entire audience, they were forced to confront the fact that I had become everything they said I couldn't be. I stood then, slipped my phone back into my pocket, and closed the binder. "Excuse me," I said quietly, "I should check on the grill." And I walked away, leaving them sitting in the silence of their own disbelief. That night, fireworks exploded across the sky, lighting the neighborhood in bursts of red and gold. But for me, the real fireworks had already gone off, right there at the patio table, when the silence finally turned in my favor. The reveal wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Because the truth, once exposed, does all the work for you. The reveal at the barbecue was just the first strike. It rattled my family, but I wanted more than their shock. I wanted permanence. Something they couldn't dismiss as luck or timing. Something they couldn't bury under silence. For that, I needed public exposure. Fortunately, the world of logistics doesn't thrive on glamour, but it thrives on results. When companies save money, they talk. Word spread faster than I could have imagined. By the fall, my inbox was flooded with inquiries. One email, in particular, changed everything. It came from a journalist at Midwest Business Weekly, a regional magazine with a loyal readership among small and mid-sized companies. The subject line read, "Interested in your story." She'd heard from one of my clients that my platform had cut their distribution costs by 18% in under a year. She wanted to interview me, feature the technology, maybe even put me on the cover of a special innovators issue. For a moment, I hesitated. Silence had been my weapon for years. Breaking it now meant stepping into the spotlight, something I'd avoided. But then I thought of my father's words, Daniel's smirks, Claire's pity. Exposure wasn't just validation, it was accountability. Proof stamped in ink, circulating beyond our dinner table. I agreed. The interview was clinical, factual, exactly how I liked it. I walked the journalist through my process, my company's growth, the savings we generated. She snapped photos of me at my desk, the binders lined neatly above, the framed email from that first COO. When the article published, it was 3 pages long, headlined. From freelancer to founder, how one man is quietly revolutionizing logistics. My phone exploded the day it went live. Clients called. Prospects emailed. Even strangers on LinkedIn congratulated me. But the real moment came when the magazine arrived in print and my parents' friends started calling them. At the next Sunday dinner, Mom sat stiffly at the table, the magazine folded neatly beside her plate like contraband she couldn't hide. Dad cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes. Daniel scowled. Claire toyed with her fork. I saw your article, Mom finally said, her voice tight. I nodded. Yes. You should have told us, she continued, though her tone betrayed something closer to fear than disappointment. Fear that the narrative she and Dad had built, the one where Daniel and Claire were heroes and I was nothing, was unraveling in front of their peers. It wouldn't have mattered if I had, I said simply. The article snowballed. Local business associations invited me to speak at luncheons. A trade podcast featured me in an episode titled Smart Tech for Smarter Shipping. My platform's website traffic spiked. Clients doubled, then tripled. Public exposure had turned my private victory into undeniable reality. My family couldn't pretend it away. Their friends were congratulating them on my success, not Daniel's courtroom victories or Claire's residency milestones. The Carter narrative was shifting, and they couldn't stop it. But what struck me most wasn't their silence. It was their attempts to rewrite history. Daniel cornered me in the kitchen one evening. You know, I always told you law wasn't your path. Tech suits you better. Guess I was right. His smirk didn't land this time, it looked desperate, brittle. Claire tried a softer approach. I always said you were smart, Alex. I just didn't realize how much you had going on. She avoided mentioning the countless times she'd called my work cute or pointless. Even my father faltered. He poured me a scotch, his old ritual of approval, and muttered, impressive numbers. You've done well. His words felt like gravel in his mouth. But I didn't let their revisionist history distract me. Because exposure wasn't about winning their praise. It was about stripping them of their power to define me. The magazine, the podcast, the speaking events, they had cemented a truth that no Carter family dinner could erase. I was no longer the ghost at the table. I was the storm outside the window, impossible to ignore. And for the first time in my life, the silence belonged to them. It didn't take long after the article, the podcast, and the speaking events for the balance of power in my family to flip. And when it flipped hard. The same people who once laughed at me, mocked me, and dismissed my work suddenly wanted proximity to it. The reversal wasn't loud, it was insidious. It crept in through half-finished sentences, forced smiles, and invitations that hadn't existed before. It started with Daniel. One afternoon, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, his voice came through, tight but polished. Alex, hey. So, I've got a client at the firm, big logistics company, national scale. They're struggling with inefficiencies. Thought maybe I could connect you. We could. Partner, maybe. You handle the tech, I handle the contracts. Could be lucrative for both of us. I almost laughed. The same brother who once called my work a lottery ticket was now asking to cash in. I told him I'd think about it, knowing full well I wouldn't. His tone carried something I'd never heard before, not superiority, but need. Then came Claire. At a family dinner, she pulled me aside, her voice hushed, her eyes wide. Alex, you know the hospital's been struggling with supply chain issues. Shortages, delays. Do you think maybe your software could help? I could put in a good word with the administration. This was the same sister who once suggested I should teach coding to children because it was more useful. Now she was asking for my expertise. For my help. Even my parents shifted. My father, who once told me I'd never be anything, started bragging to his friends about my entrepreneurial streak. He'd drop my name in conversations, claim he always knew Alex had potential. My mother clipped out the magazine article and left it on the coffee table, strategically placed for visitors to see. But their revisionist history didn't fool me. I remembered every silence. Every smirk. Every word of dismissal. I carried those memories like receipts, sharper than any ledger. The reversal was satisfying, yes, but it wasn't about revenge dinners or gloating speeches. It was about watching them drown in their own contradictions. At one gathering, Daniel made the mistake of trying to spin my success as his foresight. I always told Alex he should focus on tech, he said casually to a group of family friends, as though he'd been my guiding light. I didn't raise my voice. I simply pulled out my notebook, the one I'd been keeping for years. I flipped to an entry dated 3 years prior, written in my cramped handwriting. Daniel, another app? You know 99% of those things crash and burn. It's like buying lottery tickets. I read it aloud, calmly, in front of everyone. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Daniel's smirk collapsed. That was how I handled the reversal, with proof. Their own words, mirrored back at them. No embellishment. No exaggeration. Just receipts. The truth is, I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't even need their recognition. What I wanted, what I got, was their reckoning. The quiet realization that the narrative they built around me had collapsed. That they weren't the authors of my story anymore. They tried to claw back into relevance, but it was too late. The roles had reversed. I was the one with leverage now, and they were the ones seeking scraps of my attention. I didn't slam the door in their faces. I didn't need to. I just let them sit in their own discomfort, let them realize the cage they once locked me in had become their own. And that was enough. Because real revenge isn't about shouting "I told you so." It's about standing silently while they choke on the weight of their own arrogance. And in that silence, I finally felt free. The final act didn't come with fireworks or applause. It came with a quiet clarity I had been waiting my whole life to feel. It was December, the end of a year that had changed everything. My company had grown beyond what I once thought possible. Multiple developers worked under me now. We had clients in 6 states, revenue climbing steadily toward 8 figures. I'd moved out of the shoebox apartment into a loft office with polished concrete floors and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The card table and flickering lamp were gone. In their place, polished desks, servers humming, a whiteboard covered in expansion plans. But success wasn't about the money, the office, or even the growth. It was about the silence of my family finally realizing they had been wrong about me all along. The final scene played out at Christmas. The Carter house was dressed to perfection. A 12-foot tree, ornaments glittering under warm white lights. The table set with mom's china, a roast turkey at the center. The smell of cinnamon and cloves filled the air. Daniel arrived in another tailored suit, Claire in a cashmere sweater, both ready to play their golden roles. But something had shifted. The air was heavier, the laughter thinner. After dinner, when the coffee was poured and the pie slices handed out, Dad raised his glass for the traditional toast. But this year, his words faltered. To my children, he said, eyes flicking between Daniel, Claire, and finally landing on me. You've all made me proud. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Daniel stared into his drink. Claire forced a smile. Mom dabbed at her eyes. And me? I just sat there, calm, steady, no longer the ghost at the table. Later that night, as coats were being gathered and leftovers packed into foil, Dad found me in the den. The same den where years earlier he'd told me I'd never be anything. The room smelled faintly of the fire in the hearth, shadows dancing across the bookshelves. He stood there, drink in hand, not meeting my eyes. Finally, he said, I was hard on you. Maybe too hard. But look at you now. You proved me wrong. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like inevitability. I didn't gloat. I didn't lash out. I didn't remind him of the cage he'd built with those words. I just looked at him, steady, and said quietly, No, Dad. I proved me right. Then I left the room. That was it. No dramatic showdown, no shouting match, no tearful reconciliation. Just a line drawn in the sand, clear and final. Because revenge isn't about changing their opinion of you. It's about no longer needing it. It's about reclaiming the power they once had and walking away with it in your hands. That night, as I stepped out into the cold winter air, the snow crunching under my boots, I realized I didn't need another word from them. Not praise. Not apology. Not recognition. Their silence was enough. The world around me was quiet, the sky sharp and black, stars scattered like code across the void. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel like a cage. It felt like freedom.